Welcome back to The Joy of Vinyl. I'm Rick Coste. In a recent episode, I talked briefly about burn-in and whether it takes a while for equipment to reach its full sound potential. Well, this week's question is not about burn-in, but it's somewhat related in that it involves powering your equipment. And this question comes from Greg, who asks, would you recommend leaving my equipment on? I've heard it can damage it by constantly turning it on and off. Well, thanks, Greg. I've heard this too, many times over the years, both from friends and in forums online. While I will never claim to have the final answer on any topic, I can provide a little bit of insight. One thing we can say for sure, and it goes with anything powered by electricity, is it will wear down over time. I'll stay away from things like energy bills and any hazards around fire hazards or any concerns around fire hazards, and stick with the topic as it concerns the equipment itself. Should you leave it on? And are there benefits for doing so? As with everything audio related, there are no easy answers. But I will say in general, it's a good idea to shut your equipment down when you're done using it. In general, and I emphasize in general. There are exceptions, and that completely depends on the equipment being discussed. But first, it is true that some circuits, when introduced to the wear and tear of being constantly on, could shorten their life. Heat is an enemy to capacitors and circuitry. That's why you see air vents on amps and receivers, the casing, I should say, the casing on the amps and receivers. It's to let the heat out. If it all stayed cooped up inside the box with nowhere to go, we'd end up with a useless metal box before too long. In no instance is heat a good thing. Well, there are instances, but not when we talk about audio equipment. It's also true that shutting, say, your solid-state amp on and off also introduces wear and tear. Going from a cold state to a sudden powered-on state introduces a surge of electricity that will stress the components. Stress is just as bad as heat in most cases. Constantly turning equipment on and off will cause the components to wear down. So what am I saying here? It sounds like I'm advocating for both, which makes no sense. The question that Greg asked was, should I leave my equipment on? Yes, and well, no. I know I'm contradicting myself, but let me clarify. Tube amplifiers should not be left on. Tubes have a shelf life, and it's completely dependent upon their use, like a light bulb. And tubes get hot. They get very hot. Like I said, heat is not our friend here. Vacuum tubes degrade with use, and they're not cheap either. Tube rolling can be fun, but it's not so much fun when your tubes burn out unexpectedly. So what about solid-state amps? If your amp has a standby circuit or a standby mode, it will enter this state when the equipment is not being used for a certain amount of time. For instance, the default state when it's completely off will be 0 watts. That makes sense, right? When it's on, the wattage increases. My Denon 600 NE power amp, I don't know if you can see it over here, it has a standby mode that kicks on after 30 minutes of no audio coming into it. When it drops into standby mode, the wattage is about 0.3 watts. It keeps the current or the electric current at a minimum, and it's ready to power up when needed. In this case, I have no worries. But if your amp does not have this feature, then I suggest shutting it off. If you're not sure, just check online or the amp's documentation. It'll be listed somewhere if the feature's included. Amps do produce a better sound when warm. Now, I didn't address speakers, and there's a reason for that, but to keep it simple, if they're powered speakers, there's probably no benefit to leaving them on. Shut them off when they're not in use. The same with the turntable. If it has an on button, there's no benefit to leaving it on. Just shut that off too. And like I said, for tube amps, shut them off. Solid-state amps, if they have a standby mode, you're good to go, and there is a slight sound benefit. If there's no standby mode or you're not sure and can't find the answer anywhere, I'd be safe and shut it off. So Greg, hopefully this answers your question. And as I said, there's never a one answer fits all, but we can come close. So keep the questions coming. And if you enjoyed this episode and want to know when new episodes are released, click subscribe over here. And until next time, please take care of yourself and enjoy your records.